Thank you. I appreciate you coming out. I don't really know how to follow that, so let's go ahead and have it in. No, I'm just joking. You're not going to get off that easy. We're going to still have a sermon. I know you're going on turkey now, but we're still going to go with it. All right. We live in a world that is stained, that is diluted, that is corrupt by sin. I think each and every one of us can stop and think, this is not the way that it is supposed to be. I mean, if you don't, just watch the news for 5 minutes and you will begin to see this is not the way the world is supposed to be. Look at the wars that we have had all throughout history. That is not the way that this world should be. I mean, even if you look at events of this past week, that is not the way this world should be. Sin has stained the world. Sin has corrupted the world. It has diluted what God has called the world to be. But we also see that sin even taints the church at times. We don't like to talk about that area very much. We want to focus on the world. We never want to focus inward. But any time that you see gossip in church, sin is there. Any time that you see a member that comes and wants to be served and gets mad when they're not served, but not wanting to be a servant, you see sin is there. Every time that we become so inwardly focused that the only thing ministry is to take care of each other and not to be the hands and the feet of the word of Jesus to the community, sin is there. That is not the way that the church is supposed to be. When we look at our own lives, we can see I am not the way that I am supposed to be. There's still sin in my life. There's still things that I need to get rid of. When I look at my own life, I can see I am not the way that I am supposed to be. And we see that within the psalm. We're continuing our sermon series on the songs of ascent. And we're in Psalms 130. In verses 1 through 4 it says, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my plea for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who would save?" There's something in the psalmist's life that has caused him to feel like he is in the depths. And the picture there is he is in the depths of the ocean. He's drowning, and there's no way out. He feels like it is hopeless. He doesn't know where to turn. You know, sin oftentimes does that to us, doesn't it? I mean, sin, it's tempting. And let's be honest, sin can be at times fun, or at least first it seems that way. If it wasn't, nobody would sin. There would be no temptation. But it ultimately leads us to a point that we feel like we're in the depths. We feel like we're drowning. We feel like there's no way out. And what does the psalmist do? He cries out. He cries out to the Lord. He knows that is the only place he can turn. And he asks that question. If God would count our iniquities, if he would count our sins against us, who could stand? Could you? I could. If he counted my iniquities, if he counted my sins against me, and I stood before the presence of God, there is no way I can stand. But everything changes. The very next verse. The very next verse says, "But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be free." Everything changes on that word, but. Who could stand if God would count their sins against them? Nobody could, but with you, there's forgiveness. I love in the original language what it literally says is, but with you, forgiveness. With you, forgiveness. I find that a little bit more powerful. With you, forgiveness. Now notice that the forgiveness here is very inclusive. It doesn't say, with you there's forgiveness as long as you don't do this. There's forgiveness for you as long as you haven't done this. There's forgiveness, period. He'll forgive the murderer. He'll forgive the gossip. He'll forgive the liar. He'll forgive me. He'll forgive you. I love that next line. It says, but with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. And that sounds a little weird to us, doesn't it? It seems like it should say, and with you there's forgiveness, so that you may be praised. But it says, so that you may be feared. And I pondered on that for so long. What does that mean? So that you may be feared. We talked about last week what it means to fear the Lord, that it is holding Him in reverence, but it's a little bit more than that. It is a fear, because when we learn to fear Him, we can learn that there's nothing else to fear. When I studied this and when I looked at this, when I pondered on this, the only thing that could come to me is when I realized who I am. When I realized just how bad of a sinner I am, and if I had to stand in the presence of God and to hold account for my sins, that's a fearful thing. New Testament writer said it's a fearful thing for a sinner to fall into the hands of an angry God. When we learn just how merciful He is to forgive us our sins, the only outcome, yes, is praise, but it's also fear to realize who He truly is, a holy God. Verse 5, it goes on and says, I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in His word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than the watchman for the morning. More than the watchman for the morning. Anytime a psalmist repeats himself, there's significance. He's telling you, pay attention. This is important. That he's waiting for the Lord more than the watchman for the morning. Let's paint a picture. Imagine that you are the watchman. That you're standing at the gates of the city. And you are looking out into the darkness, waiting and wondering if the enemy's going to come. All throughout the night, you're attentive. You're watching. You're on edge because you never know when the enemy might come. You're fearful. You're afraid. But when the morning comes, you know the enemy hasn't. There's that relief. And that's the picture that the psalmist is painting here. That relief for when the morning comes for the watchman and he knows that the enemy is not there. But what is he waiting for? He's not waiting for forgiveness. He's already got the forgiveness. What is the psalmist waiting for when he says, I wait for the Lord? As a watchman for the Lord. He's waiting for God Himself to come. He's not waiting for the forgiveness. He's not waiting for what God can give him. He's waiting for God Himself. What are we waiting for? What do we put our hope and our trust into? That's what it means to wait. It means, what do we put our hope? What do we put our trust in? We're waiting for God Himself. We as Christians, we already know the enemy's defeated. We already know the war is won. There's still these battles. And we still have to put our hope and put our trust in the Lord. Verse 7, it goes on and says, O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with Him plentiful redemption, and He will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Talked about this a couple of weeks ago. One of the reasons I love the Psalms so much, and what we do not do in our culture today, is we do not see the communal side. We do not see the community side of worship at times. In our culture, we're too individualistic. Salvation is an individual thing. Worship is an individual thing. But with God, that's not the way it is. With God, it's a communal thing. Now, while the first 5 or 6 verses here is referring to a man's testimony about his sins, he's crying out from the depths. He was drowning in his sin, but God forgave him. Why is telling his personal story? In verse 7, we get to the communal side of it. Because it's through the man's personal story that now he tells all of Israel, all of God's people to trust in him. To wait on him, because there is steadfast love. The word steadfast there, it literally means basically patiently enduring. It's a good picture to think of what God does with us. I'm still sinful. I still mess up. I'm still rebellious. I'm still not exactly what he has called me to be. But he is patiently enduring with me. Because he knows, as David would say, that I am just the dust. He knows my frame. He knows my weaknesses. But he's patiently enduring with me in love. But there's also plentiful redemption. Meaning there is enough redemption for everybody who is willing to come and to accept that redemption. He is willing to buy you back from that slavery that you have put yourself in. There's plentiful redemption for anyone and everyone who is willing. I want to go back to the question he asked in verse 4. If the Lord would count the iniquities against you, who could stand? There is an answer to it. The answer is Jesus. If God would count the iniquities against Jesus, he could stand. Because he was sin free. But the good news of that is if Jesus can stand, that means I can stand. If Jesus can stand, that means you can stand. When you take on his sacrifice, when you cover yourself in his blood, you've accepted what he has done. You can stand. God no longer holds your sins, your iniquities against you. And when you stand before the judgment of God, Jesus can say, I already paid for that. Sin free. I don't know about you, but I need that. And I need to be reminded that on a daily basis. Maybe that's what you need. You need to be covered by his blood so that when you stand in the judgment seat of God, he's not going to judge you according to your sinful deeds. That's been paid for. But rather, he will reward you for what you have done. If that's what you want.